You don't need to know who you are to you do you do not need to know who you are in order to start making art. In fact, making art may be invaluable in the process of discovering who you are, of finding a self, of forging a path, of constructing an identity. Making art without a purpose is also permissible. In fact, it is encouraged to play with different mediums and forms and just see what you produce, see what you generate, and tap into that source unconscious energy that comes without effort. And now you may be thinking, and I've thought this too, well, I just don't feel like making art. I don't feel motivated. I don't feel like I'm able to block out everything else, all the stress, all the worry, the overwhelming emotions, anxiety, depression, paranoia. But the thing is, you don't need to block those out when making art. In fact, it's encouraged to tap into those and really feel them. One of the things that is important as an artist, as a creative person, as a human being, is to not turn away from our shadow, not avoid and distract ourselves from what's bothering us. Of course, there's a time and a place for distancing ourselves from our ailments and taking our mind off things to relax and veg out, or just kind of simmer down. And even when we turn away from a problem, our unconscious mind continues to work on it. That's why taking a nap can be beneficial at times, or you look at a problem, trying to solve a puzzle, and you just can't, you're stuck, and then you go for a walk, and then you come back to it, and 3 new ideas popped into your head, and you have new starting points and new seeds to water and new paths to explore. The idea is simply that if you wait until you know who you are, you'll always be waiting. Because self isn't something that's eternal. It isn't something that's absolute. It's formless in a sense, but it's felt in relation to others. And so by engaging in different social situations, in different external circumstances, and trying to make contact with objective reality, it's that process of back and forth by which the subjective experience becomes personified and constructed into a self, into an identity, into something that I can say that is me. Because really, if you want to go the philosophical spiritual route and say that I am everything, that's perfectly fine. You are me and I am you, and we're all in this together as one. But at the same time, self is just as much about differentiation as it is about integration. So it's not necessarily about resolving oneself in the conflict of being different than others fundamentally, or being the same as something fundamentally. Rather, self and experience and consciousness is about inhabiting the space in between these conflicting ideals, in between these conflicting values or realities that appear to us. On the one hand, I am the center of my experience. Everything is filtered through my senses. I am of the utmost importance, and anything I do, merely by the fact that I have to rely on my sense perceptions and it's happening to me, I am a particular person in this world. But the world is also far more vast than I could ever imagine. It goes beyond my understanding. I am very limited. I'm at a very limited position to describe it in words, to put it into a song, to do it justice. And it also feels unfeeling at times. The world is indifferent. The universe, that is antagonistic toward human survival, toward my survival. It's a constant struggle, a fight to get food, to live under shelter, to be clothed and cleaned with water and soap and brushing teeth and flossing, and all these types of self-care happen because I must will myself to perform these tasks in a universe that otherwise would leave me dead. And that circles back around to not needing to know yourself in order to make art, because, well, when I assume that I don't know myself, I feel like I have to discover who I am. I feel like I have to forge an identity. I feel like I have to be certain before I begin a creative project. And if I try to be certain of something and then I'm more sure of that than I am of my own experience, that's problematic, because I need to not rely on external validation, not rely on extrinsic justification. I need to be able to be self-possessed, feel worthy in some extent, and trust my intuition, trust my senses. And that's not an always easy thing to do. In fact, it's quite difficult in the world today, because mass society at large, social media, corporate capitalism, they're all perpetuating myths, especially in the Western world, that the individual is the most important person. You are the most important person in the world, but also you're helpless against these big, grand ideas like climate change, pollution, social inequality, injustice. We feel helpless against these massive ideas, and the salvation we hear is either through religion, which has gone out of fashion, or through politics, which is becoming increasingly more divided by the day. And by subscribing to a certain ideology, we become more aligned or coherent with ourselves, but perhaps not necessarily so with the world at large, because oftentimes when it comes to ideology, what we do is we dismiss certain things that can't be explained or aren't easily digestible, and we say, well, that's not actually a problem because of this, and we reduce it to something that it isn't, and we deny the fact of what it is and turn it into something that's more manageable, more solvable, more easy to understand, or just kind of sweep it under the rug and don't address it. And that kind of ignorance, willful ignorance, is prevalent and encouraged at some points. And in order to be one with oneself, in order to feel at home in one's body, in order to feel humble but also strong in oneself, one must, above all else, face their shadow, face their dark side, not repress these negative emotions, but rather bring them into awareness and pay close attention to where they're coming from. What are they saying? What do they mean? You don't have to act on them, although action is a large part of becoming who we are. If we only acted in ways that we felt authentic, we may not act at all. We may be frozen in fear or paralyzed by analysis, because we find out who we are not just by being who we are, but by playing roles in relation to other people and acting as if we were a certain way, and kind of trying on these different personalities on for size and see how they fit, see how the style feels. And if we're living in constant kind of curled up in a ball protective shell, that isn't conducive to self-expansion, self-exploration, to growth. And a self that is not growing is not a self at all. It's an individual who has come by means of whatever to an individual who has not found their place in society, has not found their place in the world. And of course you can be more introverted, you can be more yourself by yourself, but in order to shut yourself, you're still like, even when I shut my friends out and was living by myself, I still had a lot of digital media to keep me company. I was living vicariously through other people, watching people play board games on YouTube while my partner played board games with her friends, and I didn't go because I was socially anxious. And I watch these comedy bits and I try to laugh and I try to forget the fear and weight of existence and the gap of meaning that pervades everything. And so when trying to do that, all I can say is that social involvement and community, which has become more and more commodified these days, that is, for better or worse, an important, inextricable element of consciousness that is required in order for self-growth, for self-exploration, for continuing to be oneself in the world. So, to recap, you don't have to know who you are to be an artist. And I'm a creative who doesn't create, is something that I've said before. And so I could make a video about what does it mean to identify as an artist but not produce work. And what does it mean by work is, like, there's this process of sowing seeds, there's this process of experimentation, and then the craft phase where you're kind of grinding out filling in the lines and dotting your I's, crossing your T's, and doing the more mechanical process because the bulk of the work is done, the inspiration is there, the story is there, you arrived at a certain point, and now you're aiming for completion, you're aiming towards publication. And you're not aiming necessarily for perfection, but you are interested in creating something that's probably a coherent idea, something that sticks together, something that makes sense, something that says something meaningful, and it's tact and has brevity, but also depth. And how do we move on from this point? How do I want to proceed forward? Now, there is quite a lot of stuff to unpack here, and I'm not quite sure what the best way forward is because I've just talked for 13 minutes almost, and what have I actually said? Well, I think I want to make a video about how you don't need to know who you are to start making art. You don't need to know who you are to be in the world. It's a process of trial and error, and just bringing myself out of my shell. It's a process. You don't need to know who you are. Self-knowledge is overrated? Not quite. Self-knowledge is the most important, but it's impossible. Self-knowledge is impossible. Self-knowledge, what does it mean? To know yourself, you have to engage in different circumstances and pay attention. And is self-knowledge a cure-all? No, because you're still aware of your flaws, and you still might want to change them, and even if you don't know who you are and you engage in the creative process, there's still something to be desired. What is it? If you wait till you're ready, you'll never start. You don't need to know who you are to make art.